Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us this month's Lunch and Learn program. I'm Pam Sanfilippo, the Learning and Engagement Director for the Eisenhower Presidential Library and Museum. Before we get started, please take a moment to silence your cell phones. Today's program is part of the Eisenhower's Middle Road Speaker Series in partnership with the Kansas City Public Library, where the Eisenhower's Middle Road exhibit is now on display through May 24th. So you've got about a month to get over there and see that if you haven't. This exhibit and associated programming is made possible by a grant to the Eisenhower Foundation from the Ewing Marion Kaufman Foundation of Kansas City, so we thank them for their support. These Lunch and Learn programs are made possible courtesy of the Eisenhower Foundation and the Jeff Coate Memorial Foundation here in Abilene, and we thank them for making this possible as well. We are very honored to present today's speaker. As the longtime editor of the Papers of Dwight David Eisenhower, Louis Galambos probably knows as much about the military hero turned commander-in-chief as anyone alive. Louis is a research professor and editor of the Papers of Dwight David Eisenhower at the Johns Hopkins University. In addition to the Eisenhower Papers, he has published numerous books and articles on modern America, the modern corporation, and the importance of entrepreneurship. Based on his most recent book, Eisenhower Becoming the Leader of the Free World, Professor Galambos is going to talk about how Dwight Eisenhower, a small-town boy from Kansas, became the leader of the free world. Not only is this book available for purchase in our gift shop, but Lou will sign copies following the presentation. Please help me welcome Professor Galambos.
It's good to be here. We did a lot of research here, and I did a lot of research for the book here. And I can't tell you how important the library is to research in modern American history. And it's a wonderful institution, and these kinds of libraries are open to everybody. Anyone can do research. Anyone can come to different conclusions. We'll have a little bit of that when we talk a little bit later about Ike. There are different conclusions about Ike, and we'll talk about that. So it's great to be here. And it's also nice to see all of you and to see this kind of program. I think it's just great. Now, I spent a lot of time editing the papers, and I don't know whether you're familiar with how you do that, but you do it day by day. So you do it day by day. You look at the correspondence, and you look at what's written, the written record, and then you look at the incoming, and then you try to figure out what the issue was, and you try to figure out whether anything came of that. This includes 63-page JCS, Joint Chiefs of Staff, memoranda, and then you realize that the man read those. And he didn't just read those, he read those carefully, and he wrote all over them. And when he got excited about something, he'd write a lot, and he'd go all the way around like this, writing all the way around, so you had to keep turning them around in order to read what he said. So we followed that for years, and we published 21 volumes of the Papers of Dwight David Eisenhower. 21 big, thick books. Now, these are the kind of books that you try to read when you go to bed at night. And when you read them, they come down and crush your chest. These are chest crushers. And some of the biographies are chest crushers. They're 800 pages long. And some of those books that are so long produce guilt. You don't finish them. And then you take them to the beach and you don't read them. They stay in the car and you feel guilty about it. So each year you take War and Peace with you. You're convinced you're going to finish it, okay? So I decided I was going to write a skinny book, okay? And I have, all right, it's a book designed to be read in 2 or 3 nights, and if it comes down on you, it won't hurt. You can just turn the light off and go to sleep, okay? So it was a lot of fun to do. I had worked on the papers from 1945 on, and when I started the research for the book, I started to go back into his childhood. And I saw his grades, and I saw things about him that indicated he didn't always do what his mother wanted him to do. Now, he had a little trouble with his father, and a lot of trouble with his older brother. Some of you may have had older children in your family. They're bossy. I had an older sister who was bossy and did everything right. Maybe that's why I did some things wrong. I thought about Ike, and I thought about when he was at West Point, he had a fair amount of trouble. And I tried to get an explanation of why this man who represented, as he was an adult and a leader, he represented order, organization, and unity. But he was not that way at West Point. So I went back looking for his personality. And what I came up with were 2 ideas that were very useful to me. One of them is identity. Everyone in the room has an identity. It changes. It's the story you tell about yourself. And you tell it every day in what you do. You tell it every day to people with you, your spouse. You tell it to your boss. You tell it to the people who work for you. You project that. That's your identity. And it changes over time. Your personality is very stable. But your identity changes, and Ike's identity changed in dramatic ways over his lifetime. The other idea, that's one thing. That's what you tell about yourself. Then there's your reputation. That's what other people tell about you. And that's very often not the same as your identity. There's often a gap. And in Ike's case, there was a big gap, and it created problems in his career. So I went back looking for that identity, and I found in Ike problems that I think explained his problem about authority. Now, there's 2 kinds of authority, up and down. Ike never had a bit of trouble with authority down, with authority among his colleagues, or when he was a coach. He never had any trouble with anyone, and when he was in charge of a platoon, he never had any problems with people. He dealt with those very effectively. His problem was with authority above him. I find in academic life that the people fall into 2 different groups. One gets along with the dean and has trouble with the students. The other one gets along with the students and has trouble with the dean. They're a very tiny group of people who deal well with both, okay? And we're going to get Ike to that point. We'll work on it here. Now, his identity initially was that of a small town boy. I had a great advantage here because I came from a small town. And a town that got to 7,000 by counting horses and sheep. Wanted to feel that it was a little bit bigger than it was, but Princeton, Indiana, not Princeton, New Jersey. That's where millionaires live. Princeton, Indiana, okay, was a small town of about 7,000, and I played on a football team that lost its first game that I played in. We lost 60-0. Yeah, I'm not going to tell you what my coach said. It isn't printable, but he was very upset about that. But I understood that small town mentality. Ike, as a young man, had priorities. There were things he liked better than other things. First was football, closely tied with baseball. He liked football, baseball, sports. Second, he liked girls, which was healthy. And third, he liked school. So school had to be pushed a little bit, okay? But Mom did that. His dad was a sort of grumpy man who didn't have, aside from a negative sense, he didn't have much impact, I think, on Ike's personality. His older brother certainly did. And Ike competed all the time with a brother who had laid out of school for a few years and so ended up in Ike's class. So you had competition with your older brother who was called Big Ike. And you were called Little Ike. That's not good. That's not good for you. You could feel what that was like. And Big Ike always seemed to be the captain. Little Ike played, but Big Ike was right in the center of all of the attention. So when Ike got to West Point, by that time he had already begun to turn away from his father. His father didn't drink. Ike drank. His father hated cigarettes. Ike smoked. He got a lot of demerits for smoking. He wasn't supposed to smoke at West Point. He would sneak out to smoke. At D-Day, do you know how many packs of cigarettes he smoked on D-Day? 4 packs of cigarettes in one day. Yes, that'll kill you. Eventually, I suppose it did. It was indirect, but it's terrible. But that was a tense time in his life. So he got in trouble. He also blew out his knee and had to find something else to do. And in addition to being a cheerleader, he became a coach for the JV. And that's when he developed a particular talent. He was really good as a coach. He knew how to handle those young men. And he knew how to help them. He was a little bit older than them. He knew how to handle them. He knew how to deal with them in a fair way. And he dealt with them from the beginning. He had a sense of humility. Now, we often don't associate great leaders with humility, but most of them have that. When you get behind the facade that's out there in the front, okay, that's for public relations. That's the media vision of somebody. I deal with the media vision by reducing it by 50%. Whatever the media tells me, I say is probably only half right. If they say everything's wonderful, I cut it down. It's okay, but maybe not wonderful. Everything's terrible. We're going in the tank. We're probably going to do a little better than that, okay? So it's handy. But everybody has that facade out there. But behind that, Ike had some humility. And he turned out to be a very good coach, and he got locked in. His reward for being a good coach was bureaucratic lock-in. Some of you may have experienced this. When a bureaucracy decides something about you, it doesn't change its mind overnight. And so Ike had to fight off the image that he was primarily a person who could do coaching, but wasn't really headed to the top. And he didn't seem to have that ambition to get to the top. But then his identity changed as he met Fox Connor. And Fox Connor is one of those unusual men who recognize things in other people. So General Fox Connor, who also did the same thing with Patton, recognized that Ike had great talent. And he was the first person who became a mentor for Eisenhower. And he helped him do 2 things. He helped him learn how to move up the military bureaucracy, and he helped him learn at the same time be ambitious about that and to know learn the capabilities you have to get up that ladder. So he took Ike with him to Panama and trained him up. He spent hours and hours and hours, and Ike spent hours and hours and hours learning to be a leader. Learning to be a leader at the top, not in the middle or the bottom. Up to that point in his career, Ike was headed for retirement as a lieutenant colonel. That's all he would have made. But from that point on, his career starts to take off. But Fox Connor had to do something to break the hold of the military bureaucracy, because it was locked in. And even after Ike started to show superior capabilities, superior sort of mind, and a sense about strategy, the military kept sending him for assignments as a coach. And Fox Connor was a very clever man, and he could manipulate that bureaucracy, and he did. He used his personal relationships, and he in effect sponsored Ike. So Ike needed a mentor, and he was the first man in his life who really had a dramatic impact upon his personality and his identity. He needed support. He needed sponsorship. So he got that. And Fox Connor helped him get the right kind of assignments. The right kind of assignment with General Pershing, a great national leader in the First World War. The right kind of assignment with Douglas MacArthur, who was Chief of Staff. Now, some of you may have seen a picture of Ike and General MacArthur at what was called the Bonus Army. A bunch of people who marched on Washington and demanded the bonus that they'd been promised for serving in World War I. They needed it, all right? They needed it in the Great Depression, all right? But they were unruly to some extent, not as much as General MacArthur thought they were. And there's this picture of General MacArthur with those boots on, standing there looking very smug, very happy to be moving militarily against the bonus army. Ike was upset, unhappy, told MacArthur that he shouldn't do it, told him to go back to his office, he wouldn't do it. And they started, in a sense, to split apart at that point. Nonetheless, when MacArthur went to the Philippines to build a force there, Ike went along with him and served with him. Those were hard years. Because of his earlier orientation about authority, it was tough to deal with General Douglas MacArthur. He was a hard man to deal with. And Ike developed some of his rules about how to handle people, how to treat other people, as a sort of negative response to what Douglas MacArthur did. Now, MacArthur had a great number of qualities, and he had a rapid ascent in the military. He was a famous man in many ways, but Ike resented the way he dealt with his people who worked for him, that is, authority down. And so he developed his own view of that, of how to work with that. So about that time, General MacArthur decided that Ike was doing too much on his own. He was dealing with the Philippine authorities because MacArthur didn't want to bother with it, so Ike took it over. And Douglas MacArthur resented that. So he cheated on Ike. He sent Ike back to the United States for a while to do some work. When he came back, Ike found out he had been virtually replaced by somebody else. And this I call Ike's first really Machiavellian moment. Remember Machiavelli and the Prince? Yes. Yes. And so this is the first time he really encountered that himself, a kind of personal betrayal. Kind of thing that makes you a little more cynical than you were when you were in upper school or high school. You get a little more cynical about power. You begin to realize what the world is like and what men do and women, yes, men and women, you realize that. You get a different sense. He had another moment, and I'll tell you that in a moment. So I now came back to the United States. We're headed into World War II, and he got his second mentor, General Marshall. General Marshall, like Fox Connor, recognized the talent that Ike had, and he pushed him up over a whole bunch of other people. That may not sound like much to you, but believe me, when you're dealing with the Congress of the United States, and the Congress takes an interest in those military appointments at the top, you better be careful. Well, Marshall recognized that he had to have younger leadership, more vigorous leadership, if we were going to take our place in the war. And so he moved Ike up above a whole bunch of people, and he became Supreme Commander in Africa. Well, some of you may remember the Casablanca Conference. Well, Ike was done in by the British at the Casablanca Conference, and in a clever way, the United States, after the war had begun, the United States and the British were supposed to be allies. But it was not easy to deal with the Brits. For one thing, they were contemptuous of American military experience. As individuals, they were often contemptuous of American military performance in Africa. They were contemptuous of Ike. They thought he was okay as a political leader, but not as a military leader. So they put a British leader in between Ike and the combat forces. Now, that was insulting to Ike, and his entire career, he had sought to get out of staff work and be in charge of a combat force. Now, at that point, he could have quit. Or he could have done what many people do, throw down an ultimatum. Throw down, I'll leave if you don't do what I want you to do. As far as I know, from studying the Eisenhower Papers all those years, he only did that one time in his life. And it wasn't when they put the British commander in between him and the forces. He went ahead, worked hard to preserve unity. At one point, he gave commands to his own officers and his men how they had to deal with the situation with the Brits. And one of his officers ignored that. He had a spat with a British officer, and he called him a British SOB. So I sent him home, sent him back to America, said, it's okay if you call him an SOB, but you can't call him a British SOB, okay? So he had a sense of how to do this and what to convey to people about what the culture of that force was going to be. And unity, he recognized, and that's been true for his entire career, unity was the answer. We had to work together effectively, preserve our alliance, all right, and win. And he was dedicated to that. Now, that was his second Machiavellian moment. Now, his big turning point in his career, it's kind of like a lever. He had what very few professionals have, which is one defining moment. And that was the decision on D-Day. The decision to send that giant armada in. And he made that decision, 4 packs of cigarettes. He made that decision, made the right decision, picked the right day, and became America's leading hero of the Second World War. That was followed, as you know, by his service as Chief of Staff of the Army, then as President of Columbia University. He never really got much time to be at Columbia because they kept using him down in Washington. He went down and was informal chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So he's on the train going back and forth. He's trying to be president of Columbia University at the same time that he is chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. That is a hard job. He went from there to a supreme military commander of NATO, and then back to run for the presidency. Now, here's one of those disagreements between myself and other scholars. I think Ike was told, I know that he was told that he could become president from 1943 on. People were raining in letters to him, messages. You can be president of the United States. Now, I think all that time he treasured that idea. I think he wanted to be, very badly, to be president of the United States, but he did not want to lose. One, he did not want to lose the nomination. He did not want to lose the election. His brother, Milton, who was president of my university twice, once when he was normal sort of president, once when they brought him back because we had an emergency, we needed real leadership. Well, his brother knew more about politics than Ike did. Ike didn't know that Washington scene as well as Milton did. Milton talked to him about things, advised him, gave him an awful lot of help. He got along with that brother, not with Ed, the older brother. The older brother gave him advice endlessly, and most of it I ignored. So he ran for the presidency, made the nomination by a hair, and won the presidency twice by a substantial majority. Now, what kind of president was he? Was he a president for all seasons? Well, I don't think so. His life was, I think, shaped to a substantial extent, his presidency certainly was, by the fact that we left the Second World War and entered a Cold War with the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union and the threat to national security, and remember, Ike had lived through Pearl Harbor. He was dreadfully afraid of a surprise attack. And if you want to know why he sent that last U-2 flight over the Soviet Union, it's because of his fear of a surprise attack. And he wanted to have that information that was supplied. So Ike, as president, knew that the first priority was to prevent World War III. World War III, very early on, 1945 and 46, he had recognized would be over in 3 days. There was not going to be a great tank battle at Kursk. There was not going to be all the soldiers. We're not going to have trench warfare. The war was going to be over. It was going to be nuclear. And he recognized that everything had changed at that point. That's when he developed a new strategy, the new look, and with modifications and some media polishing, and that it's continued to be America's basic strategy for dealing with the world since that time. Recognize that you could not have an army that would do everything. You couldn't afford it. He recognized that you had to be able to keep a successful economy through the long run. He was getting ready for 100 years of war with the Soviet Union. He did not predict that the Soviet Union would collapse. And there were very few Americans, there's maybe one or two, who did predict accurately that the Soviet Union had absorbed too many nationalities and would ultimately collapse. But he didn't know that. He thought that we would be in this for 100 years, at least. So he prepared us for the long run. And that meant first having a powerful military. And those of you who remember the farewell address about the military-industrial complex, which he warned Americans about, need to read the first part of the speech, which says we need a powerful military, okay? And we have to be mindful of how it can affect our politics, but we have to be strong to deal with the world. So he developed a strategy, it seems to me. He emphasized throughout his presidency unity. That meant unity with our allies, unity as far as we could have it within the United States, and he also wanted unity in his own government. He ran the cabinet in what was really a military sort of style. Anybody could say anything, anybody could propose anything, but once you decided what the policy was going to be, he wanted you to line up. Then you line up. That's why he hated interest groups. Interest groups don't quit. After they lose, they go to the courts. When they go to the courts, if they lose there, they go to the public. They'll do anything because they get paid to do that, all right? So interest groups really irritated him, and part of his condemnation of the military-industrial complex was a condemnation of the services as interest groups and of the interest groups outside representing the military forces. He wanted unity. He wanted the American people to agree on their values. He thought their values were important, and he wanted to have a successful economy. A successful economy meant for him, even though he was a Republican, he kept high taxes until he had the budget balanced. 3 times in his 8 years, he was able to get a balanced budget. Stop and reflect on what it would take us right now to get a balanced budget. Impossible, that's what I heard. And I think it is, yes, right now. But he achieved that goal 3 times. He got slow but successful, moderate growth, expansion of the workforce for women in America, in new jobs that they were taking as a result of their education and the opportunities that were now opening up. So he got the kind of thing that he thought was true of what he called the middle way. The middle way in between extremes. Extreme on the left, extreme on the right. One of the people on the right was Ed, that older brother, who told him he wanted to get rid of Social Security entirely. He wrote back, he finally blew up. He'd had enough of Ed. He wrote back and told him, if anybody in political life proposes getting rid of Social Security, you'll never hear of him again. And he was talking about Ed directly, okay? The letter was to him. Everybody should probably write one of those letters to their sibling. If they have an irritating sibling, it helps a lot to get it off your chest. So he gave us unity. He had a strong sense of priorities. All right, he stayed on that. And he had patience. Now, I think he would be a strong president anytime national security was that important. And he certainly was a strong president for America in the 1950s. Thank you. We've got time for some questions, and I want you to know that when I fly, I grade the pilots on the quality of the landing. When I landed in Kansas City this time, he got a C+. We bounced a little bit, and he got C+. I've never had an F on landing, but I've had some C's, B's, and A's. But I'll also probably be grading you about your questions. So I want some good questions out of this group, okay? And to ask a question, you have to get the microphone, okay?
Raise your hand if you have a question.
So use the microphone. Come on, come on, come on, come on. This is too smart a group. There's right back there. Okay. We can't have any fun without Q&A.
There's been a lot of debate and concern about ICE's relationship with Kay Summersby. Could you comment on that?
Oh, I will comment on that. Yes, I wrote one footnote on Kay Summersby in the book because I said everybody had to have a view on this very attractive, very personable British woman who was his driver in Africa and with whom it is said he had an affair. As far as I know, they never slept together, but I think I had what in high school would be called a crush. He was away from home, She was beautiful and she loved Dyke, and so I think he had a crush on her, and that's where it ended, as far as I can tell. He went back, restored his marriage after being away for all those years. It's not good for men to be away that long. They lack the leadership from women that they need. All of us do. I have 4 daughters, 1 granddaughter, and a female cat. I've learned over the years how to take orders and where the wisdom is involved. So in Ike's case, ultimately, his mother had more influence on him, and his sense of compromise and middle way leadership than his father did. So I think that was important for him. Now, more questions. Come on, here we go. We got some questions up here. A lot. It's popping up now.
Just Eisenhower, when he left office, was ranked 23rd out of 34
Yeah.
presidents, and now he's in the top 5.
Top 5. That's by historians
Why is that? Why is
and
that?
other scholars. Well, we keep having more presidents. Every time we have a new president, we find flaws in that president. Well, of course, that's what the media does. That's what we do. We're demanding. We want them to be perfect. Ike was not perfect. No, I'm saying he was a great leader, but he was not perfect. He was, like the rest of us, a person in a time and place. He made decisions. They were not all great, but more of them were good than bad. And that's what we ought to be satisfied with, but we're not. So as these polls take place, he gradually marched up. And now he's up there with good company. People like George Washington. Holy moly, George Washington and Abraham Lincoln in the top 5, and Ike. Yes, he's now generally by scholars ranked in the top 5. More questions. We got more here. There we go. We're warming up now. You don't get burned when you ask a question.
This country is very deeply divided.
Yes.
What can we do working together to be working together?
Well, we need leadership. Leadership will be, I think, the most important ingredient initially. Ultimately, we may not want to be together. I don't know. I can't predict that. Historians deal with the past. We don't deal with the future. We all have the present in mind. We can't get rid of it. But I believe the start will be with leadership. And right now, I do not see much chance that we're going to have the kind of unity that Eisenhower thought was absolutely essential. Well, we have threats. We are threatened in a world with nuclear weapons. And we're threatened in a way we weren't in the 19th century. We never had any threat to our national security in that way. We are now. If you're asking me, do I think we need more unity? Yes. But will we get it? It'll come from the leadership at first.
You mentioned General Fox Connor's mentorship of both Patton and Eisenhower, and I understand Patton was perhaps disappointed when Eisenhower became in charge of Northern Africa. I wondered if you could speak to their relationship in World War II.
Ike handled that really well. Patton didn't handle it as well, given his personality, his flair. He was, unlike Ike, his career was all lined up for him right from the beginning. I mean, he was dedicated to that career with great intensity. He was older than Ike. He served in World War I in Europe. And he had every reason to believe, as most people do, that they're qualified for that job. But he wasn't. And Ike had to handle that, and he had to do 2 things. He had to keep Patton on board to use him effectively. Machiavellian moments, use effectively. You have to think about that. You can't just blast off. And he had opportunities. He sort of put his career on the line when Patton had the slapping incident in Italy where he could have been court-martialed. And so I stayed behind Patton, kept him, and when they landed on D-Day, he kept Patton in reserve until it was time for the breakthrough. When the breakthrough came, that's when Patton was most useful to the United States. That is an amazing example of Eisenhower's leadership, to have kept him effective, ready to play that role when he could do it better than anyone else in the military. So I think that's the kind of leadership. You have to swallow some things. You have to compromise when you don't want to. You got to deal with Monty. Montgomery was a pain in the where someplace. Pain, yes, I'll keep this on a little higher level, but he was a pain for Ike every day. He was a pain for Ike every day. And Ike had to swallow that, and he knew he was the British leading hero of the war, and he had to deal with that, and he did. We've got some questions up here.
Prof, thank you very much. My name is Dr. Aminu Gusau. I was at KU, worked in KU for over 10 years, then moved to Africa, and now coming with some of my friends on a leadership quest. And we've been doing this for years, annually coming to visit Eisenhower Presidential Library. And we're getting a lot. Now, a quick 2 questions. Number one, one of my friends asked me a question that, what does Ike means? Ike, I-K-E. How did he get that name? That is one. Can I go ahead and ask the other question?
Well, no, let me deal with them one at a time. I have a very simple, straightforward mind. Well, he was called, as I said, Little Ike in high school. Ike is a way of not being forced to say Eisenhower. It shortens, okay, it's a nickname. It came, the background of the family was German, as you probably know. Half of my background is German, the other half is Hungarian. The Germans lived a long time, so I got my cardiovascular genes from them. That's why I'm here today. So it was very common to use the nickname Ike. And everybody had a nickname in high school. Mine was Skip. Can you imagine? Okay.
Yes.
Next question.
Next question is trying to compare leadership concept in the 21st century and leadership concept before the advent of 21st century, and looking at Ike. Now,
relative to whom?
Relative to focusing on leadership, sir.
Yes.
Let me land, then probably get where I'm trying to target. Leadership, long time ago, some even feel that leadership, you are born leaders, meaning inherently, they are leaders, and then changes over time. And yesterday we had discussion on emotional intelligence in leadership.
Yeah.
Now, though emotional intelligence in leadership became pronounced in the 21st century, however, from what I did, I have seen emotional convictions in the way he deals with people. I have seen his ability, even when he was teasing his brother Ed on the social security aspect. Social security basically is needed, and people are still very happy with it. We have seen a lot he has really done. So I'm trying to say that, how did you see that role of emotional intelligence plays in Ike? I remember you said he smoked cigarettes, fine. He was even thinking that he would retire in the military as a lieutenant colonel. But then coming with somebody who really became a perfect role model. I said, no, you can do that. You can go to the higher.
Yeah.
And that has really happened. So the inspiration of that leadership is the source of that inspiration. Do we see more combination from what either his mother, probably his father, have done for them? Oh, good. That's
The mother.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Well, you can see that emotional aspect of his leadership in his humility. And if you want to get back to the humility, you want to look at the speech he gave at the end of the Second World War. It's a wonderful speech, and it's characterized by humility about his role. And he honored all those who served and died for that goal, and not himself. So that's a very important speech, and I think that was true. And that's a function of emotion, to be able to do that. And I think he had humility about his ability when he came out to Abilene. He gave his first speech during the presidential campaign in Abilene, and it bombed. He bombed in the rain. It was a terrible occasion. He didn't know how to do it, and he had to learn. So he had humility. He got people to tell him how to give a talk and how to be effective. We now have television. How to be effective on television. How to be a political leader of that sort. So I think there is that thread all the way through. The key, I think, is to deal with other people with fairness. And that means just that you understand them. He understood people who didn't have a big income. He understood people who lived on their Social Security. And he didn't forget that. He never forgot that. That's why he increased Social Security. He compromised. Increased Social Security, compromised in other ways. He built that wonderful, started that wonderful national road system that gave me I-70 so I could get here today instead of till tomorrow. We had a lot of really bad roads, okay? And when I started in graduate school, in fact, I used to drive back and forth between Connecticut and Indiana, and invariably in West Virginia, I would be behind a coal truck. Now, if you've ever gone up a hill behind a coal truck going 7 miles an hour, throwing mud and water all over your windshield, okay, you'll understand the kind of frustration people felt about those highways. So he wanted to change that, and he did. And so I think there is that emotional strain all the way through his leadership, and I think it was extremely important. Now we gotta wait, whoa, gotta wait till you get your mic.
Good afternoon, sir, and thank you very much for that excellent lecture. It's a privilege to be in your presence today. Thank you. My question is related to President Eisenhower's work with enforcing the desegregation ruling of 1954. You alluded to the fact that that was a huge headache for him. Would you just talk more about that era and his role and his approach?
Yeah. Here we've hit on another one of those issues where there's sharp disagreement among scholars who know a lot about Eisenhower and about the times. My own view is that he was in the segregated military for that whole career, and it was 1945 before he saw that something had to change. And the reason he saw that something had to change was we were running out of men in combat. First, the Germans ran out of men on the Eastern Front. Then the British ran out of men on the Western Front. Now, by 1945, we were running out of combat men. And Eisenhower decided that he was going to desegregate the military, and African Americans for the first time could be in combat units. That, I think, was the first break in his mind, And then when he came back to the United States in Washington, I think he thought more and more about that as chief of staff. He was entirely in support of Truman's policy about desegregation of the military and of Washington. He worked vigorously, and then he got the only bill he could get through by working with Lyndon Johnson. Again, he had to work across the aisle between Democrats and Republicans. And so I think he had something of a conversion experience. His leading advisor on this was a man named Rocco Siciliano. And Rocco advised him when he was meeting with African American leaders to avoid one word: patience. Rocco said, do not ever use the word patience. They had suffered long enough. Okay.
Thank you for having lecture once more. I'm part of the team on leadership
Okay.
in Africa, and
Welcome.
thank you. It's an eye-opener being here, and it's very touching to see that we have leadership from Eisenhower. But I think America is losing it, and the world is losing it. I don't think America is taking that leadership position any longer.
No, wait a minute, I'm a little hard of hearing. This happens to men when they hit 70, and they become hard of hearing in the range first that women speak in. Now, I don't know whether that's an evolutionary response or not, but I am hard of hearing. So repeat that last part for me, will you, so I get the question just right.
I said, Eisenhower, I put it this way, meant a lot, not only to America, but to the world, because he fought for peace.
Yeah.
And I think, from my observation and from what I've seen in this little museum put out there, that the world is facing peace challenge and they need leadership. And America has obviously shied away. You are a historian, you don't want to talk about the future, but the future means so much to the world. When next is America going to give us another Eisenhower? That's when next is America going to take leadership to bring peace to the world? What do you think about that?
I believe he thought that was his major accomplishment was of his presidency, and I think the world thought that too. Remember that when the British and the French and the Israelis invaded and decided to take the Suez Canal back from the Egyptians, he sided with the Soviet Union, not with his British allies. He was upset by an attempt to go back to gunboat diplomacy. That's what he saw it as. And he wanted to preserve the peace and stability in the world. So I think I agree with you, and I think that was part of the reason he made that ascent into the top 5, was because of recognition, not just in the United States, but also around the world, of his role in seeking peace. And also, as he said, it was peace with honor for the people. Peace with honor, not just a peace imposed by dictatorial authority. So he was a great friend of democracy. He wanted as much as he could have in the United States, and he tried to encourage it overseas. That's very difficult to do. He had weak points. He didn't understand the revolutionary process very well. And he had trouble in dealing with social revolutions. That was, I'd say, one of his chief challenges was to learn more about that. And for many Americans, that's a challenge. Remember, we had troops in China opposed to the revolution. We had troops in Mexico. We had troops in the Soviet Union. Or what was Russia then, opposed to the revolution. So a lot of Americans have had trouble understanding other people's revolutions.
I think we'll take one more question.
Okay?
In terms of rating, how would you rate his relationship in his rapport with McCarthy? On a scale of
Okay. Here he was advised by Milton very strongly, and by others, not to get down in the gutter publicly with McCarthy, because he would elevate the senator if he did that, and work quietly behind the lines to bring him down. And that, I think, is what he did. Now, personally, I guess in events like that, I would like to see my leader telling the American people what was going on. There was not a lot of transparency about that. And so I personally like to see leaders lay it out on the line. But I think in this case, Ike was right. He didn't do what I want to do. Maybe that's why they didn't elect me president. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay, it's been fun.